Pull all the stops out till they call the cops out. Grind till you're fined or you're banned. But you gotta get a gimmick if you wanna get a hand.
Hello, Quiet Writers. This is Andreou. The Conservatives gathered this week to look at 4 potential leaders and decide the direction of the party. More in Common has done significant research on what the Tories actually need to do to become electorally competitive again. But did Tugendhat, Cleverly, Jenrick or Badenoch's prescription match that diagnosis? I spoke to More in Common's chief, Luke Tryl, at their conference in Birmingham.
If you want to get ahead.
Riot.
Hey, Luke.
Hi, Alex.
How are things in sunny Birmingham?
Well, despite the rain and the wind, the Tory mood is a bit sunnier than you might have imagined, slightly weirdly, for a party which just suffered its worst defeat in electoral history. There was sort of buoyancy to the mood at the conference and perhaps a little bit of what you might call over-optimism that Labour's recent struggles might see them back in power sooner than they thought.
Yeah, it seems to me they've either gone through all stages of grief very quickly or they're still at denial.
It might be a mix of both, actually.
Terry Pratchett used to say that, the opposite of hope is not despair, that there is something when you go through despair and out the other side, which is a sort of anti-hope.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely see a little bit of anti-hope there, and certainly some of the messages being put forward by the leadership candidates weren't exactly painting a picture of sunlit uplands, but were much more focusing on what was wrong with Britain than what was right.
Right. Your latest research is all about the path to rebuilding the Conservative Party effectively. And so I think it's more useful for you to talk us through that first, what you found, before we go into the 4 leadership speeches, since really I want you to measure them precisely against this yardstick, if that makes sense. So you found some, I would say, pretty counterintuitive stuff, not to me or to you, but certainly to the general wisdom within the party faithful about which voters the Conservatives need to win back.
Yes, absolutely. As you know, there is this sort of big debate in the Conservative Party about which group of voters they chase first, which group of voters that they lost they try and woo back, and which is the greater priority. And you will have seen that a lot of the noise and discussion coming out of the conference was that it should be reform voters that the party focused on. I think, activists, some commentators really want to win back that reform vote. But what our polling showed was that reform voters might actually be the hardest group for the Conservatives to get back. We asked in our poll different types of voters who the Conservatives lost. When might you consider voting Conservative again? And the interesting thing is that reform voters, only 1 in 10 of them said they would consider voting Conservative again this Parliament. For Liberal Democrat voters, it was actually 1 in 5. And for Labour switchers, people who left the Tories for Labour, it was 1 in 4. So what our research says is that if the Conservatives were being, we think, particularly savvy, they would take a 3-phase approach. And actually, they wouldn't start with switchers at all. They would start with Conservative voters who reliably vote for the party, who basically stayed at home this time. They were so cross with the Conservative Party that they decided not to go out and vote. And crucially as well, and I think this gets a bit ignored when people analyse how well Labour did, they weren't scared enough of Keir Starmer to go out and vote. That's a triumph of Labour strategy there, because this group are not habitual non-voters. There's always this sort of debate in politics, can you get non-voters out? And it's very difficult. This group, if you look at them, of those who voted Conservative in 2019 and didn't vote this time, for 3/4 of them, it was the first time they ever hadn't voted. So they are normally reliable Conservative voters. So getting them back is the first step. And how do you get them back? Well, when you ask that group, what does the Conservative Party do at its best? It is sound economic management first, standing up for Britain second, and law and order third. And I think we can both agree that during the last Parliament, the Conservative managed to at least project that they were failing on all three measures, particularly economic management when it came to that mini budget. So that's step one.
Can I ask you something,
Yeah,
Luke?
of course.
Because this is the conundrum always for opposition, isn't it? How do you prove that you are better at those things when you're out of government?
Well, I do think some of it relies on the government making missteps. I think the Conservatives can be as effective opposition as they want, but if Labour runs a perfect game and runs the board, then, Labour will be re-elected. But I think to take out, and this is what Keir Starmer did, right? Keir Starmer benefited from Tory missteps. But the reason that he was then able to take advantage of that and ultimately end up in government was because people saw the Labour Party was serious. They actively junked some of the proposals, which on the economy meant people were a bit worried that they were going to spend too much under the Corbyn proposals. They repudiated the past. I think the Conservatives are going to have to think very hard about what they say. Look, we did this before, or we pledged this before. Actually, that was a mistake. And it was interesting, despite lots of the talk at conference about making mistakes in government, there wasn't that sense that they'd identified 2 or 3 policies that they were going to say, you know what, we did that wrong. But I think that's a prerequisite to winning back that economic competence point.
There was generally, I thought, a lack of reflection, actually. There was a sort of great looking forward, but I think when you've just come off the back of that election, there needs to be a little bit of an autopsy.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting. We had at our More in Common reception, one of the speakers was Nadine Dorries. And she was really interesting because what she said is, I can understand, I remember 2005 when David Cameron got elected, it was all about the future. But you can't look at the future without looking at the past, looking at precisely what went wrong and, having a proper autopsy. I don't think it's good enough simply to say we got immigration wrong, right? I mean, that you can look at any opinion poll and it tells you that breaking promises on immigration went down badly with people. But there wasn't that digging into, for instance, was it wrong to say stop the boats entirely because it raised expectations so much? Was it wrong to make Rwanda the be and the end all when something like the Albania returns deal actually was making progress? That there was a striking lack of that. And I think that's necessary both for what we call phase 1, getting back those normally loyal Tory voters, and phase 2, which is winning back Labour and Liberal Democrat switchers. Interestingly, 33% of those who voted Labour, having switched from the Conservatives, now say they regret it. Now, whether that will hold, I don't know. But, that should be the low-hanging fruit for the Tories. Mm-hmm. They've got to convince that group they've learnt the lessons about why they lost them in the first place. And then our research basically says, look, if you've done 1 and 2, if you've got loyal Conservative voters back, if you've got some Labour switchers, some Lib Dem switchers back, you start to look competitive again. And then you can say to Reform voters, you've got a straight choice. It's a Labour government or a Conservative government. The last election, there wasn't a straight choice. Everyone knew the Conservatives were going to lose. People go vote Reform. Because the interesting thing about Reform voters, I don't think this will surprise you, but it's the extent of it is quite striking. They really don't like Labour. In fact, they are around 7 times more likely to say they preferred Rishi Sunak's government to this current Labour one. But they're not going to come back. And I think this is really crucial. They're not going to come back by the Conservatives trying to outbid Reform, because you will never be able to. You can't outbid Nigel Farage on net zero. You can't outbid him on immigration because he'll always go further. And crucially, lots of Reform voters are very different to the Tories. Tory voters massively disapprove of Donald Trump. Reform voters don't. Tory voters support Ukraine. Reform voters are much more split on it. It's very difficult for the Conservative Party to just think like Lego bricks, you can add the two together. So I think that what they've got to do is get those other voters back on side, pitch to Reform. And they won't get all Reform voters back. Some Reform voters are very similar to the radical right we see in Europe, and it is very hard to reach them. I think they will keep voting for a while for populist right parties. But there's another group who I think the Conservatives or Labour could win back, actually. They're basically just disillusioned with the system, with the status quo. And I think that group, the Conservatives, and this is what our data shows, they should be targeting them. So it's not about choosing particular voters, but it is about the phasing and how you present yourself.
Understood.
Quiet, Riot.
Now, onto the speeches. Shall we take them in the order they happened?
Yes.
I guess it's as good as any. So, Tom Tugendhat was first. What did you think of the offering he made? And then we can go into the style and tone and how it was received.
Well, the interesting thing about Tom is that he obviously, I think more than any of the other candidates, his pitch is basically, I'm your sort of oven-ready prime minister in waiting. And if you looked at his speech, it was the one that, for instance, perhaps unsurprisingly, given his background, spent more time talking about foreign affairs than the other speeches. So he talked a lot about China, talked about Iran and the current conflict. He talked about Ukraine. He also talked about, what he thought the Conservatives had done well, for instance, in education. And he also, I think it was quite interesting, he tried to sort of hit back at this suggestion he didn't have the experience by saying, well, actually, if you look at what happened in the last government, we don't want managers, we want leaders. And it was really rooted in this idea of him as the prime minister. It was much more, I guess, I'm Tom, I'm ready to be prime minister, than some of the other speeches we'll go on to talk about, which were a little bit more ideological, you might say.
Yes. And that was also, in many ways, its failing, because if you make yourself the central figure, I think the central figure has to be a little bit more exciting than Tom, if I'm honest. I found him actually very John Major-ish.
Gosh, that's harsh. But no, I think, chatting to people afterwards, I think there's a sense actually that Tom had a very good conference up until those speeches. If you saw him on the fringes, he was dynamic. He had the best merchandise. You could even get, Tom Tugendhat tattoos. He had a lot of energy. And it just didn't seem to be there in this speech. There was just something a little bit flat.
Part of that would have been a function of going first, I guess.
And, the audience weren't warmed up.
Yeah.
They weren't quite ready. So I think it's partly that. But I slightly wonder for Tom whether he just peaked too soon in conference season and that he just didn't have quite enough left in the tank to push him over. Or, this is the alternative, he was trying to draw a contrast with the more ideological, more high-energy candidates, and in doing so, presented himself basically as too much of a safe pair of hands.
Instead of keeping us safe, he wants to police smoking in beer gardens. He's freeing criminals, not standing up for the police. Now, I know what it's like when a Labour government doesn't have your back. The last Labour government left our troops without body armour in Iraq and without helicopters in Afghanistan. As your Prime Minister, I will never abandon those on the front line.
My impression was that he sort of crammed a bit too much in there, and that's partly a feature of the shortness of the time they had. He would go in one sentence from smoking in beer gardens to troops being left without armour, and it really jarred. And all of it was an attack on Labour. There was not an identifiable chunk that said, this is what the dysfunction within our party is, this is what we might have done wrong and hence we were ejected, and this is what we've got to fix. It was just, if you make me leader, then I'll just hammer Labour and we'll be back in power in 5 years. And the method by which that happened was not particularly clear to me.
Yeah, I think that is fair. You didn't come out of that speech thinking, I know what Tom Tugendhat's political philosophy is. And you might think I'm now being unfair the other way here. You might slightly compare it to a sort of Keir Starmer style speech, actually, because there wasn't that much, as you say, in terms of a sort of meaty policy offer or diagnosis. But I guess the flip side is Starmer does acknowledge what went wrong in the Corbyn years, and you didn't hear that from Tom. But I think he is the candidate.
And also, I think fundamentally, Luke, I don't think that's a bad comparison. I think that's a fair comparison. But Starmer came after Corbyn. After Johnson and Truss, the Conservative Party got Rishi Sunak, he was their Starmer. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
There wasn't some extreme figure to be replaced by a safe pair of hands. The Conservative Party lost the last election pretty badly with
Yes.
the person that effectively had the same platform as Tom Tugendhat had at least when they were bidding for the leadership. The platform was very, very similar. It was, I'm competent, I succeed. When I put my mind to anything, I work hard, I'm honest, I'm not a man of excesses. And so I think to select another figure like that now for the next election seems to me a tall order.
I mean, in some ways, well, whether the members are up for something like that, I think is different. I guess the one distinction I would make is that was Rishi Sunak's offer, but as we know, he's not a very good politician.
No, that's true.
Politics, which were terrible. And I guess if your diagnosis is, look, his offer was brought for a Conservative, was broadly right, but he was just a terrible politician, and Tom has the political skills that Sunak didn't, then you might go for Tom. And as I say, I think if he had just had a speech which was just a little bit more exciting, there'd be more buzz around him now, whereas the candidate we're going to come on to talk about, I think, stole the show.
Yeah, and I think James Cleverly, who was next, I think that's also part of Tom Tugendhat's problem, because we are seeing broadly two candidates on the right, two candidates on the left. And it felt like during the conference, because they will be now whittled down to two, they were more in competition with each other than they were with the other camp, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's true of James and Tom. I think Kemi is trying to fish for some of the centrist votes, but we can come to talk about that.
Yes, let's.
But, he's not. But it is very definitely true. I mean,
okay, so Cleverly.
So the really interesting thing, I think, two things, and it's my personal opinion, we haven't done any research on this yet, were that James did two things which the other candidates didn't, which I thought was really important. Firstly, he started his speech with an apology. And we've got some polling out today that says the public really want the Conservatives to apologise, actually, for some of the mistakes in government and to change as a party. So he did that. And then the second thing, and again, this wasn't a policy piece, but I think it was an important acknowledgement when he said, we just need to be a bit more normal.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about this before, but there is just this part, but we know from the focus groups, part of the reason that the Conservatives lost the election was because, people would say, well, the Lib Dems now in these blue wall seats just seem a bit more normal. They seem a bit more like a sort of everyday person that cares about the same things that I do. So I think those two things were almost more important than anything else. I mean, he did have some policies in there. You talked about abolishing stamp duty, 3% on defence, looking at nobody being taxed more than 50% on what they earn. So there was some policy there, but I think it was the style actually with James. And I think he just found a way of doing something which both, I think, connected with the Conservative grassroots, but also presented himself as actually someone relatable that you could see doing the job. He talked about his record as well. I think people often forget he was both Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary. So I think of the speeches, because he did a bit more of the diagnosis and because he managed to present a vision of what James Cleverly's Conservative Party looks like, I actually think he had the best of the day today.
Yeah, I think he's the one that best understood the format and the length. And so what he did was a sort of, those contestant reels that you see on X Factor that sort of say, this is who I am, this is what I think broadly about things. And he came across likable, which not everyone did. And I think he's the only one that really made an attempt to speak to the outside world as well as the whole. And I think that was actually quite smart.
I think so too. And one of the things that we know from focus groups we did over the summer that voters like about James Cleverly more than anyone else is the fact that when he talks about his backstory and coming into politics, he's much more relatable than lots of the others. He's not, obviously it's not a sort of normal story because he became Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, but you can relate to it. People would say over the summer, he's kind of like the opposite of Rishi Sunak, isn't he? When it comes to his upbringing, I thought rooting his political journey in his life story, talking about his parents, but also talking about running a business, which ultimately failed as well. I just think there were lots of things which people in the outside world, as much as they watch these things, could connect to in that you didn't perhaps see in some of the other speeches.
On the negative side, I thought, interestingly, that the practical stuff, the this is me, this is my story stuff, worked a lot better than the inspirational stuff. I don't think he's quite learned how to sort of build rhetoric yet. And the other thing that I thought was striking was that he was the only one that dismissed reform out of hand explicitly.
I thought it was really, yes. I think to your first point, I think you're right. And again, the public in their wisdom, I think, are always right about these things. The negative that they said over the summer about James Cleverly is, he's relatable, he seems decent, but is he more than just a good bloke? There's something, I think...
That's interesting.
He's got a challenge there, and you put it perfectly, of saying, people seeing him as a statesman. You talk to people who worked with him in the Foreign Office, and they loved having him there and thought he was great with other diplomatic equivalents, but there's definitely a perception thing. And the reform thing was really interesting. He went out of his way to rule out any sort of deal with Nigel Farage. But also, I think it's really interesting that he actually clearly wasn't fully formed, but he also went into a sort of critique of reform itself.
Yeah.
He talked about reform didn't deliver Brexit, reform didn't cut immigration. We can beat reform by being a better version of ourselves. I thought it was really telling that he went for that. I can tell you, though, from the conference, there is clearly a significant part of the membership that think the path forward is some kind of deal with reform and Nigel Farage. So whether this puts him at loggerheads with too big a chunk of the Tory base, and it's worth remembering those that go to conference are more active, more engaged, tend to lean slightly more to the right, those members, than the membership at large who don't go to these things. But there is going to be a bit of pushback there.
And never forget, reform didn't deliver Brexit, we did. Reform didn't cut immigration, I did. And mark my words, we will beat reform by being the best version of ourselves, not a pale version of anyone else. So no mergers, no deals.
I actually think that James is particularly, again, if it all goes wrong for Labour, the Conservatives could get back. I still don't think it's the median assumption that the Conservatives are back in a term. It would be historically quite unlikely. But I also think James offers another benefit to the party, that even if he's not going to end up being Prime Minister, of all of them, you could see him stabilising the ship. You could see him stopping the leakage. And again, can't predict the future, but it wouldn't surprise me if even if he didn't win, he got the Conservatives back to a decent share of the vote, which set them up for the future. Yeah. And so, in terms of doing that, it's become known as the sort of Neil Kinnock job. You could see James Cleverly doing that, right?
Quiet, Riot. Next came Robert Jenrick. I don't think it's unfair to say that compared to the expectation, his was the dampest squib of the day.
Yeah, and of course, this is where I'm going to give him a bit of slack. He lost his voice during the conference, and so it meant his speech was a little bit raspy at times. But I think there was a more fundamental issue with his speech, in that it was basically almost too laser-like crafted on what one assumes that right-wing activists want to hear. It felt, we know one of Jenrick's challenges is, do people believe he's made this journey from kind of more on the left of the party to the right of the party? And I felt his speech, rather than being flat, just felt a bit inauthentic. at times when he was saying some of the stuff is, sort of attacking woke, attacking net zero.
Yeah, I think you're being very kind, to be honest. I'm not sure it felt inauthentic. It felt like it had been put together by AI. It felt like you told an alien, these are the 20 things that the Conservative Party really loves. Find a way to put them in 20 minutes. And that's what he'd done. And all of it was so artless. I just don't think he's really not of the stature required for the job. That was my overwhelming impression. He was a smaller person trying to fill a bigger suit.
I think that, I think there is something in that. I mean, I think the AI generated point, as you say, if you wanted, I wouldn't even say conservative greatest hits, I would say right-wing activist greatest hits. That was what came out of the speech. And you didn't get that sort of depth of thinking. I mean, even down to talking about new conservatives, it was difficult to know really what that was pointed at. I mean, are the new conservatives reform light, or are they something different?
They have had 14 years to prepare for government. Where's the vision? Where's the boldness? The country just voted for change, and all we've got is more managed decline. Sir Keir Starmer will take the knee, but he will never take a stand. It is painful that Starmer can't see what we see. A nation that has given more to the world than any other. A nation brimming with potential, with talent, with so much to offer. Let down only by big government and small-mindedness, by high taxes and low ambition. Starmer sees a Britain fated for decline, needing more migration, more tax, more spend, more woke. The country needs a leader.
And what's really interesting is one of the things we know Jenrick is trying to do is to model himself on the Canadian opposition leader who has run on a platform of house building, but also tackling immigration. But again, it didn't really feel like, as you sort of say, the suit fitted him.
I mean, to me, the closest parallel, I would say, is Marco Rubio, actually. He's someone that has sort of said all the right things to agitate the right of the party, who looks good on paper, and then you see the actual person and you think, that is not at all what I was expecting.
Yeah, I could agree with that. And I would also say that I think there is a real danger for the Conservatives, particularly on net zero, of being seen to go down a sort of rabbit hole that aligns you more with, reform, with Nigel Farage than the public at large, because we're not the US. We have a consensus on climate change. And it seems an odd thing for a party which has just been absolutely shellacked to pick a position which is deeply unpopular with the public. Again, I just felt lots of it was directed very squarely to the Conservative online commentariat rather than voters directly. Now, there are some people saying Jenrick got it, maybe he'll have his Starmer pivot moment. But it's a little bit odd at this stage to be sort of thinking, we think he's saying this just to win and then he's going to switch. And we know voters like authenticity. So I thought there was a lot of risk.
The final climactic section began with, I am for leave, the Magna Carta, habeas corpus.
We will never do that. It is impossible unless we leave the European Convention on Human Rights. And we free ourselves from Tony Blair's Human Rights Act. The choice before us is leave or remain. I'm for leave. I'm for the country. I am for the country of Magna Carta, of the habeas corpus, of the Bill of Rights. I am for finishing the job that we started with Brexit and restoring to our people and our parliament its sovereignty.
Yeah, like I said, not particularly good AI. And then the final person was Kemi Badenoch.
And look, it was a very Kemi speech, I would say. It was the sort of speech you would have expected Kemi to make. So, she leant in very hard on identity politics. She talked about the fact that basically the last Conservative government had lost its way, that it didn't have a plan, that it wasn't telling the truth. It was interesting. There was a bit of it in there where she really went for lots of institutions. So she talked about the Treasury, the Equality Act, the Bank of England, devolution, quangos. And I think what might worry some Conservative MPs and even members was that that's quite similar to some of the rhetoric you would have heard from Liz Truss.
A comprehensive plan to reprogram the British state, to reboot the British economy. A new blueprint for the great machine of our country. One that goes far beyond the relationship with the EU or the ECHR. A plan that considers every aspect of what the state does and why it does it. A plan that looks at our international agreements, at the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, at judicial review and judicial activism, at the Treasury and the Bank of England, at devolutions and quangos, at the civil service and the health service.
We know, it's interesting again, talk in focus groups about Kemi, and one of the things people always say, she's refreshing.
So is an enema.
But I very mean. But I worry, and actually, the interesting thing is what will be remembered for Kemi about this conference is less this speech and more some of the comments leading up to it, particularly around maternity pay, the NHS, minimum wage. And I think, again, from conversations out, she's got too many people going, there's been refreshing and getting attention, but will there just be too many fights if Kemi becomes leader? And I thought it was really interesting in her speech that she devoted the least time of any of the candidates to talking about what she thought had gone well in previous Conservative governments. So, the other three talked about Ukraine, they talked about school reform, they talked a bit about, Brexit and the economy. Whatever you think of those, Conservatives can make a case for them. Hers really didn't. I mean, it really was, we need a total break with the past. Yeah,
I thought it even had a dig at Boris Johnson, actually. I've jotted down here that she said that when we went after Labour votes, we lost our own. And that seemed to me like a reference to 2019.
Political parties win when they convert people who voted for the other political party. And if it's a critique of, if you just blindly follow focus groups, you get nowhere. But, it's at least useful to know what the public are thinking and how you can pitch your message to them. So, I do slightly worry. I think, some of the philosophy and ideas and Kemi's thinking about the state and how we make it work, I think is actually amongst the most interesting of the candidates. I think one of the challenges, though, with it is it a bit too full on? And if you say to the electorate, look, this is me, take it or leave it, as we know, the electorate can go, fine, leave it.
I think if you are planning to have that kind of comprehensive review of everything, then you have to couch it in terms that frighten people a little less than things like the stealthy poisoning of our country must stop and rewire, reboot, reprogram, which sounds a little bit Stalinist, to be honest. There was something also in her manner. She seems to me like someone who's always telling you the thing for the third time and is slightly annoyed that you're too thick to have understood it the first two. And I didn't get any warmth at all from her, which I did, for instance, from James Cleverly.
I think inherent in Kemi's pitch that you are either won over by her ideas and worldview, or you're not. What there's not going to be is the personal outreach to bring you there, to get you there. It is going to be, she's willing to walk through the fire and you can follow and lead to, what she thinks is a better outcome, or you can't. And as I say, I just think...
Or you get burned.
Yeah, or you get burned. Yeah, or you get burned. I just think there is something there of... I also think, a Kemi that was slightly more willing to bring people with her, that was perhaps slightly less willing to get into some of the fights, would be more effective, actually. Because she's clearly got something. She has something, I think, that very few politicians have. And as I say, people want to listen more to her. but there could be too much of that. And remember, we've talked about before, one of Starmer's most effective messages during the election was around a politics that treads more lightly in your lives.
Yeah.
It may not be the case, but I worry that Kemi, as opposition leader, the politics will be very much in your lives, in your face.
Yeah, we shall see. It seems to me that her pitch is basically, I want to kick the table over and start from scratch. And that kind of pitch, like if she were pitching it in 1945 or 2009 after the global financial crisis, it might find a more willing audience. After the ordeal that the country has been through in the last few years, I'm not sure there is much appetite for someone else to kick everything over and start again. But, what do I know? Right, Luke, very quickly, MPs now get the privilege to reduce those 4 down to 2.
Yes.
What do you think will happen?
Well, look, I mean, the Tory MPs are a very difficult electorate to predict. They're also not always the most honest electorate, as they'll admit themselves. I think the consensus opinion now is that probably on, I think it's the 9th, when they vote, that one of the candidates of the left probably doesn't have enough votes to go through. If you look at the betting odds, that suggests it would be Tom at the moment. And then you get into the really interesting vote of the final 3 on the 10th of October before it goes to the membership, when I think it is all to play for there. You would expect a lot, if it is Tom that's knocked out, a lot of his votes would go to James, or at James, you'd expect them to go to Tom. So I think there's a chance that you end up with a top 2, which is Cleverly and Jenrick. Could still be Jenrick and Badenoch, which is what everyone assumed going into it. But I actually think it's very open now. I think that's what this conference season has done. I think the 2 front runners haven't done quite as much as they needed to. And I think the other 2 candidates now have a slot of getting on the ballot.
If you were James Cleverly, because I think the scenario you describe is actually quite credible, the most likely thing is that Cleverly will gather enough of Tugendhat's votes to leapfrog into second, basically. At that point, if you were James Cleverly, would you rather go to the membership against Jenrick or against Kemi Badenoch?
It's a really good question. I think Jenrick.
Because one is quite accident prone,
Yeah.
the other is sort of less inspiring and possibly a less experienced campaigner as well. That's something to consider. But
I just think, given it is very clear there is, Kemi has a particular appeal to the membership, I think both Rob Jenrick and James Cleverly are both going to be hoping they face off against each other rather than her. Because, as I say, and you chatted to members at conference, and again, she has really captured the imagination of some of them. And of course, there's the other question, which is not just who would you rather face, but is there some vote lending between candidates to stop Kemi Badenoch from getting on the ballot? Now, it's quite risky. There are only 121 Tory MPs, right? There's not many votes to play around with. But, you could see that sort of scenario. It would also be really interesting if Tom does get knocked out, or whoever gets knocked out, if they endorse. I think that will be really interesting as well.
Fantastic. Luke, thank you. I hope to see you very soon when you come back.
I'm looking forward to it already.
All right. Enjoy the rest of your stay.
Quiet, Riot.
Well, there you have it. I hope you found it all useful. And if you're sitting there thinking, why should I care? Let me say this. Our entire political system, for good or ill, is adversarial in nature. The quality of the opposition to the government is not only essential to probity, but one of the most influential factors in the shaping of policy. As annoying as the process can be, ideas that have had their tyres properly kicked will always be better ideas. As you may know, our policy is to make all content available to everyone, regardless of the ability to pay. But for those who can afford to support us on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, we offer the opportunity to take part in shaping our content with open editorial meetings and the chance to be part of the QR community with a group hangout. launching next week on Discord that will allow you to chat to us and each other. More on that very soon. This was Alex Andreou. Love you lots. See you soon.
Quite Right is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreou and me, Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Cadalou. Quite Right is a co-production with SandStone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Do something special.
Do something special. Do something special. Anything that's special. You're a big
You're more than just a mimic. Well, you gotta give it. Take a look how different we are. If you wanna make it, twinkle while you shake it.